the Cowman of Copalis Beach. My dad worked in the timber industry his whole life. His father was a logger before him, and he grew up in and around the woods of the Pacific Northwest, learning to read the forest the way most kids learn to read books. When he was just 18 years old, barely out of high school, he started his own logging company. Over the decades, he's owned and operated shake and shingle mills from Oregon clear up to Thorn Bay, Alaska. He's an intelligent man, the kind of person who sees a problem and figures out how to solve it. He holds over a dozen patents for various pieces of equipment he's designed and built over the years. Practical innovations born from spending a lifetime in the timber industry, understanding what works and what doesn't when you're dealing with massive logs and dangerous equipment. He's employed dozens of people over those years, all of them spending extensive time in the wilderness, cutting timber in remote locations where the nearest town might be an hour's drive away. When I was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, I remember hearing bits and pieces of conversations among some of the men at the mill. They'd be standing around during breaks, voices low, glancing over their shoulders like they were sharing something they shouldn't. Although nobody would tell me directly what they were talking about, I understood that something had happened before I was born, something involving one of the foremen, a man they called John. These weren't the kind of stories men tell to pass the time or to get a laugh. They weren't joking around. I could tell by the way they'd stop talking when I got too close, by the looks on their faces, by the tone of their voices. They were genuinely afraid of something, and they wouldn't talk about it with a kid around. When I was young, my dad wouldn't tell me about it either. I often went out into the woods with him on weekends, helping him cut blocks, learning the trade, breathing in that sharp scent of fresh-cut cedar that meant work and money and our way of life. He didn't want me to be afraid of the woods. The forest was where we made our living, where we spent most of our time, and fear had no place there. You had to respect the woods, understand the dangers, but you couldn't be afraid. But last weekend, I was visiting him, and we got to talking about the old days. I mentioned a couple of strange events that had happened to me later in life when I was working in the wilderness myself. Things I couldn't quite explain, and that reminded me of those hushed conversations from when I was a boy, those fragments of a story that had been kept from me. After some prodding, after I assured him I was old enough to hear it now, he finally told me the whole thing. And I need to share this story with you because it's the kind of thing that stays with you, that makes you look at the deep woods a little differently, that makes you wonder what else might be out there in the places we don't go. The world we lived in. To understand this story, you need to understand the time and place it happened. This was the mid-1960s in Aberdeen, Washington, a town that sat at the eastern end of Grays Harbor on the Pacific coast. Aberdeen and the surrounding area had been the heart of the timber industry since the late 1800s, when people first realized the fortune that could be made from the towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that covered the coastal mountains like a dark blanket. By the time my dad started his business, timber was still king in Grays Harbor County. The sound of saws cutting through ancient wood was as constant as the rain that fell from the gray skies, and the smell of fresh-cut cedar was everywhere. My dad's mill produced roofing products, shakes and shingles that would be shipped all over the country, that would last for generations because of the quality of that old-growth cedar. He had teams of men who would go out and cut fallen old-growth cedar salvage left after logging operations. These weren't freshly felled trees, but remnants from earlier harvests, massive logs that had been left behind because they were too difficult to transport at the time or had been overlooked. That old-growth cedar was prized for its resistance to rot, its beautiful grain, its durability. My dad had permits to salvage a large amount of wood in the coastal areas of Grays Harbor County, primarily in the area around Copalis Beach. If you don't know the area, Copalis Beach is a small coastal community about 20 miles northwest of Aberdeen, sitting right where the Copalis River meets the Pacific Ocean. It's remote even today, but back in the 1960s, it was truly isolated. Dense forests stretched for miles in every direction except west, where the gray waters of the Pacific rolled endlessly against the shore. Several of the men from my dad's cutting crews lived in and around Copalis Beach. It made sense logistically, keeping the workers close to where the timber was, reducing travel time and costs. Among these men was a foreman my dad trusted completely. I'll call him John for this story. John was bright, down to earth, a hard worker with the kind of practical intelligence that made him perfect for the job. My dad trusted him with thousands of dollars worth of vehicles and equipment, as well as the safety of the crews. That kind of trust wasn't given lightly in an industry where one mistake could cost someone their life. John wasn't the kind of man to make up stories or exaggerate. He was solid, reliable, the kind of person you'd want beside you in a crisis. Which is why what happened to him and his family is so difficult to dismiss. Monday morning, everything changes. It was a Monday morning in July, sometime in the mid-1960s. My dad doesn't remember the exact year anymore, but he remembers everything else about that day with perfect clarity. John was several hours late for work, which was highly unusual. John was always there early, getting the saws ready, checking the trucks, making sure everything was in order before the crews arrived. Punctuality was a point of pride for him. So when he finally showed up that morning, my dad knew immediately something was very wrong. John was visibly shaken, pale beneath his tan, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. My dad took one look at him and said, "John, what the hell happened?" John looked around at the other men who were starting to gather, preparing for the day's work. "Can we talk in the office?" His voice was rough, strained. They went into my dad's small office, really just a room with a desk and a couple of chairs, and closed the door. John sat down heavily and ran his hands through his hair. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at the floor like he was trying to figure out where to start. Finally, he looked up at my dad and said, "Something destroyed our house this weekend." My dad thought he'd said someone, assuming there'd been a break-in. "Was it someone you know? Did you call the sheriff?" John shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. This wasn't a person. It was I don't know what it was, but it completely trashed the house. The family is staying with my brother and Elma for a while. We can't go back there." Elma was about 30 miles inland, away from the coast, away from Copalis Beach. My dad asked John to explain what had happened, and what John told him over the next hour was one of the strangest stories my dad had ever heard from anyone, let alone from a man as level-headed as John. Friday evening, the beginning. It started Friday evening when John got home from work. The sun was still high, the way it is in July in Washington, that long summer light that stretches the day out until 9 or 10 at night. John pulled up to his house, a modest place sitting on about 5 acres, with a field out front and dense forest beginning maybe 100 yards back. His youngest son, Tim, who was around 4 years old at the time, came running up to him as soon as he got out of his truck. The boy was excited, bouncing on his toes the way little kids do when they have something important to share. Daddy, I saw a big cowman walking at the edge of the field this afternoon." John thought the boy meant cowboy. Some of their neighbors wore cowboy hats when they were working outside, protection against the sun. "Was he wearing a cowboy hat?" John asked, expecting the boy to nod. But Tim shook his head emphatically. "No, Daddy. He was a cowman, furry and stinky like the cows." It was a strange thing for a 4-year-old to say. John asked his wife if she knew what Tim was talking about. Her expression told him she did, and she wasn't happy about it. She explained that Tim had been playing on the porch that afternoon while she was inside, doing housework. At some point, Tim came running in, breathless and excited, saying the cowman was stuck on the fence. He was agitated enough that she went outside to see what he was talking about. The moment she opened the door, she was hit by a horrible smell. She described it to John as wet dogs mixed with garbage, that particular sour-sweet stench of organic decay that makes your stomach turn and your nose wrinkle. It was strong enough to make her eyes water. Tim was pointing across to the field opposite their house, toward where the open grassland met the tree line. He got loose, the boy was saying, jumping up and down. She looked where he was gesturing and saw the top strand of barbed wire on the fence bouncing up and down violently, oscillating like something had just pulled hard on it and let go. The wire was snapping back and forth with enough force that she could hear it making a twanging sound even from the porch, probably 60 or 70 feet away. But she didn't see anyone. No person, no animal, nothing. Just that bouncing wire slowly settling back to rest, and that awful smell hanging in the air. She told him to come inside and play for the rest of the day. She felt uneasy in a way she couldn't quite put into words, a crawling sensation at the back of her neck that said something wasn't right. About half an hour later, their older son, John Jr., who was 12 at the time, came home from his friend's house. He'd been walking along the road that ran past their property about a quarter-mile stretch through the woods before you got to their driveway. When he came through the door, his face was pale and he was breathing hard. He told his mother that somebody had followed him home through the woods. He never saw who it was. They never left the tree line, staying just out of sight in the thick undergrowth that lined the right side of the road. But he could hear them, or it. Whatever was walking parallel to him through the forest was big. He would hear large branches breaking, not the small twigs that snap when you step on them, but substantial branches that require real weight to break. And the footsteps were heavy enough to hear clearly over his own footfalls. The woods around Copalis Beach are dense. The undergrowth is thick with ferns, salal, Oregon grape, rhododendrons creating walls of vegetation that you can't see through. John Jr. kept walking, trying not to panic, trying to tell himself it was just a deer or maybe a neighbor. But deer don't break branches that loudly, and neighbors stay on the roads. Whatever was following him kept perfect pace with him, never falling behind, never getting ahead, just maintaining that parallel course through the trees like something tracking prey. When John Jr. reached their driveway, where the woods opened up into the field, the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, listening, but there was nothing. Whatever had been following him had stopped at the edge of the open ground. He ran the rest of the way to the house, and he was shaken up enough that his mother believed something had really happened. He wanted his dad to go check it out with him as soon as John got home, to go into the woods and see if they could find any sign of what had been there. Into the woods. Later that evening, after John had heard the full story from both his sons and his wife, he decided they needed to investigate. He strapped on his .357 Magnum revolver and took John Jr. out into the field. The sun was getting lower, probably around 8 o'clock, but there was still plenty of light. The air had that golden quality it gets before dusk, and the shadows were starting to stretch long across the grass. They walked first to the area where Tim's Cowman had supposedly gotten stuck on the fence. The field was well-maintained grass because they occasionally ran a few head of livestock on it. They walked down the fence line, John scanning the ground and the wire for anything unusual, John Jr. staying close to his father's side. Then they found it. About waist-high on the top strand of barbed wire, there was a large clump of hair tangled in the wire. Not just a few strands, but a substantial mass of it, like something had snagged itself badly and had to rip free with considerable force. John tried to pull it off, but it was really tangled up, the individual hairs woven through the wire's twists and caught on multiple barbs. He had to pull out his buck knife and actually saw through the hair to get it free. The hair was over a foot long, coarse and stringy, reddish-brown in color. As he worked it free, he noticed there appeared to be a bit of flesh matted in the clump, and the top wire had been pulled loose from one of the fence posts, bent down several inches from where it should have been. Whatever had gotten caught on that fence was very big. Big enough that pulling free had actually deformed the fence line, pulling the wire loose from the post. John handed the clump of hair to John Jr. to hold, and they climbed through the fence. The hair kind of looked like it might be from a horse's mane or tail, long and coarse like that. John was looking for hoof prints as they crossed the 10 feet of open ground between the fence and where the woods began. But there were no hoof prints. The ground was solid grass, and John couldn't see any tracks at all, though he admitted to my dad that he wasn't exactly a professional tracker. Just a man who'd spent his life in the woods and knew how to look for signs. The tree line began about 10 feet from the fence, and they entered on a small game trail that deer used frequently. You could tell by the way the undergrowth was trampled down, creating a narrow path through the otherwise impenetrable thicket of ferns and brush. Under the trees, it was noticeably darker, the canopy blocking out much of the fading daylight. They walked maybe 100 yards into the woods, and that's when they started to smell it. That same rotting garbage and wet dog odor John's wife had reported earlier. It was faint at first, just a hint on the air, but as they went deeper it got stronger, until it was strong enough to make John's eyes water and his stomach turn. John told my dad that he got the distinct feeling they were being watched. It's something you develop when you spend enough time in the wilderness, a sixth sense for when you're not alone. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and his heart rate was increasing, that primal response to unseen danger that evolution wired into us over millions of years. He told John Jr. they should head back before it got too dark. The boy didn't argue. They turned around and started walking back toward the clearing, their pace a little quicker now. That's when they heard it. Heavy footsteps off to their left, maybe 30 or 40 feet away in the thick brush. Deep, measured impacts that you could feel through the ground as much as hear. They stopped walking. The footsteps stopped. They started walking again, and the footsteps resumed, keeping perfect pace with them, staying parallel. It was exactly what John Jr. had described from earlier that afternoon. Whatever it was following them, and it was big. They were nearly back to the clearing when John made a decision. He whispered to his son to run like hell to the house on the count of 3. John Jr. nodded, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the trees. 1, 2, 3. John gave his son a hard push in the back to get him started, then spun around and raced off the trail in the opposite direction, toward where the footsteps had been coming from, his gun drawn and ready. Off the trail, the underbrush was incredibly dense. Ferns came up to his waist, branches caught at his clothes, roots tried to trip him with every step. But as he crashed through toward where he'd heard the sounds, he could hear it moving away from him, deeper into the woods. The sounds were heavy, methodical, not panicked like an animal fleeing. More like something choosing to withdraw rather than being driven away. At this point, John told my dad he thought it was probably a vagrant camping out in the woods, maybe scoping out houses to rob. It wasn't uncommon in those days for drifters to set up camp in the deep woods, living rough and occasionally stealing from nearby homes. John was a big man, capable of taking care of himself in most situations, and he had a large caliber handgun. He wasn't too worried about confronting some homeless guy in the woods. He was maybe 10 or 15 yards off the trail, pushing through the deep brush, when he heard the movement stop just ahead of him. He stopped too, trying to see through the dense vegetation and failing light. He thought he saw movement by a large tree, maybe 20 feet away, like someone was trying to hide behind the trunk. John leveled his gun to the tree and shouted, "Come out nice and slow, or I swear to God I'll come back there and shoot you." Silence. Complete silence. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then John caught movement out of the corner of his eye and spun to his right for a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. It looked like a huge bear moving through the brush. He could only see bits of it through the dense ferns and undergrowth, but it was definitely big, moving on all fours, moving away from the tree. It was about 15 feet away from him, close enough that he could see individual hairs on its body through gaps in the vegetation. At first, his mind tried to make sense of it as a bear. That would explain everything. Bears were common enough in these woods, and a large black bear could account for the size and the sounds. But then something happened that made his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. A huge, hairy arm with a distinctly human-like hand reached out of the brush and grabbed a small alder tree. The tree was about 4 inches in diameter, and the hand grabbed it about 5 feet up the trunk. John said it happened so fast it was almost a blur, but the thing used the tree to pull itself upright. It stood up on 2 legs and turned its upper body to look directly at John. It was enormous. John couldn't believe how massive it was, how bulky through the chest and shoulders. He estimated it was well over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, and at least half that distance across the chest. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms like tree trunks themselves. It was getting dark under the trees, and John couldn't make out many details of the face or features. But he could see its eyes. They seemed to glow a deep red, like embers in a dying fire, reflecting what little light there was. And he thought he could see teeth, as if it was curling its lips back in a snarl or grimace. The creature stood there for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, looking directly at John. In those seconds, John felt like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that broke all the rules of what he thought he knew about the world. Then the creature lunged forward, pushing back hard on the alder tree with tremendous force. The tree, 4 inches in diameter and presumably healthy and alive, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. It crashed into the surrounding trees, getting hung up in the branches instead of falling to the ground. Then the creature disappeared into the deep brush, moving with frightening speed, sounding like a bulldozer crashing through the forest but without any engine noise. Just the breaking of branches and the heavy impact of something massive moving fast. John stood there in complete shock. His gun was still in his hand, but he'd never even thought to fire it. He'd been too stunned by what he was seeing, his mind refusing to accept the reality of it. Then he realized with a spike of pure terror that the sounds of the creature crashing through the brush were heading toward the house, toward where his son had run. He turned and ran back to the trail, hoping to cut it off before it reached the clearing. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He hit the trail and ran as fast as he could, his boots pounding on the packed earth, his lungs burning. All the while, he could hear the creature thrashing through the brush on his right side, parallel to him, but moving faster than any human could run. The chase. John burst out of the woods into the clearing and looked frantically for his son. John Jr. was standing just inside the fence field, about 50 feet away, waiting for his dad. The boy had made it to the fence, but had stopped there, probably worried about leaving his father alone with whatever that thing was. "Run!" John screamed at him, his voice raw with fear. "Run to the house. Now!" Then he saw it. The creature crashed out of the woods about 50 feet to his left, exploding out of the tree line in a shower of broken branches and leaves. It crossed the 10-foot clearing between the woods and the fence in what seemed like a single bound, and then it stepped over the fence in 2 strides. The fence was 4 feet high, substantial post and wire construction meant to contain livestock. The creature stepped over it like it was a line drawn in the dirt. And then it was in the field, running. John couldn't believe what he was seeing. The creature was running on 2 legs with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. It was moving parallel to John Jr., who was running flat out toward the house, his 12-year-old legs pumping as hard as they could. But the creature was closing the distance with terrifying speed. John screamed at his son to run faster and raised his gun, trying to get a clear shot. But he couldn't fire. His son was in the line of fire, and beyond his son was the house where his wife and younger son were. One missed shot, one bullet that went through or past the creature could hit his family. John vaulted over the fence and ran after them, his lungs burning, his legs feeling like they were moving through water, even though he was running as fast as he'd ever run in his life. He could see the creature angling toward his son, cutting across the field to intercept him, and he knew with absolute certainty that the boy would never make it to the gate in time. In desperation, John pointed his gun at the ground beside him and fired as he ran. The .357 Magnum made an enormous crack that echoed across the field and probably carried for miles. He thought maybe the sound would scare the creature away, make it veer off or stop. Instead, it angled more sharply toward John Jr. and put on an enormous burst of speed. John heard his boy scream, a sound that cut through him like a knife, as the creature and the child seemed to collide. He saw the creature dip its shoulder down slightly, like a football player preparing to hit, and suddenly John Jr. was airborne. The boy flew about 10 feet through the air, tumbling, and hit the ground hard, rolling through the grass. The creature never stopped. It continued to run at that amazing speed in a wide loop back toward the woods, its stride eating up ground in a way that defied everything John knew about how things should move. Once the line of fire was clear, with nothing between John and the creature but open field, he stopped running and took aim. He squeezed off 5 shots as fast as he could work the trigger, the revolver bucking in his hand with each shot, the sound deafening in the open air. John was a decent shot, had been shooting since he was a boy, but he was gasping for breath. His hand was shaking from adrenaline, and the target was moving at incredible speed in the fading light. He was pretty sure every single shot went wild. The creature never made a sound, never slowed down, never showed any sign of being hit. It was over the fence and back into the woods in seconds, disappearing into the darkness beneath the trees as if it had never been there at all. John ran to where his son had fallen. John Jr. was on his hands and knees in the grass, trying to catch his breath, but he didn't seem to be seriously hurt. No blood, nothing obviously broken. John grabbed him and asked if he was okay, if anything hurt, if the creature had injured him. The boy was shaking, pale as death, but he managed to gasp out a question. Was that a bear? Apparently, John Jr. had been so focused on running for his life that he hadn't actually seen what was chasing him. All he knew was that something big and black had suddenly run into him from the side, and he'd felt what seemed like a huge paw hit his bottom, and then he was flying through the air. It hadn't tried to hurt him, hadn't tried to maul him or tear him apart. It had just knocked him aside, pushed him out of the way, and kept running. John couldn't make any sense of it. If the creature had wanted to harm the boy, it could have torn him to pieces in seconds, but it had just knocked him down. John pulled his son to his feet, and they ran through the gate and into the house, slamming the door behind them and locking it. They were both gasping for breath, John's shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. His wife was standing in the living room, her face white, demanding to know what the gunshots were for, if they were all right, what had happened out there. John told her to check that the back door was locked. He went to the phone and started to dial the sheriff's number. This was before 911 existed. You had to know the local emergency numbers, and John had them memorized. But with his finger on the last digit, he stopped. What was he going to say? That he'd been chased out of the woods by something that looked like a cross between a bear and a giant man? That a monster had knocked his son down in their field? He could already imagine the conversation, the skepticism, the questions about whether he'd been drinking. He hung up the phone. He realized he would sound like a complete idiot if he tried to explain what had just happened. So he told his wife it was a large animal, possibly a bear, and that everyone needed to stay inside with the doors locked. He didn't tell her the truth yet. He didn't know how to begin. They tried to settle in for the evening. Both boys were in bed by 9:30, exhausted by the terror and excitement. Around 10 o'clock, John and his wife sat down in front of the television to watch the news, trying to pretend everything was normal, trying to tell themselves that whatever had happened was over. Then they heard it, a loud, moaning cry from outside. It started low and rose in pitch and volume, stretching out for what seemed like forever, maybe 15 or 20 seconds. It reminded John of the siren on the volunteer fire department truck, but it was organic, alive, with a quality to it that made his bones vibrate. Then it ended with a whoop-whoop sound, sharp and percussive. It was coming from the woods opposite the house, from the direction the creature had run. John's wife looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. What the hell is that? John decided it was time to tell her everything. He described what he'd seen in the woods, the thing standing up on two legs, the glowing red eyes, the way it had snapped that tree like it was a twig, the way it had moved through the forest and across the field with impossible speed. She listened in growing horror, and when he was finished, she wanted to call the sheriff immediately. But John talked her out of it. They would sound crazy, he argued. Who would believe them? And even if the authorities did believe them, what then? What if people came with guns and dogs, and the creature hurt someone? What if they tried to capture it, and it went on a rampage? The questions had no good answers. He promised her he would handle it, that he would keep the family safe. She reluctantly agreed, but made him promise that the kids wouldn't go outside until this thing was gone. The howling went on until around midnight. Sometimes it sounded close, maybe in the woods right across from the house. Other times it sounded farther away, like the creature was moving around their property in the darkness, circling. Then, finally it stopped. Complete silence descended, broken only by the normal sounds of the night insects and distant frogs. John wanted to stay up all night to keep watch, but he was utterly exhausted. The long day at work, the confrontation in the woods, the chase across the field, the adrenaline crash that followed, all of it had drained him completely. They went to bed around 1 a.m, and despite his intention to stay alert, John fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Saturday morning, the window. When John and his wife woke up late Saturday morning, the boys were already up watching cartoons in the living room. John Jr. was the first to speak when his parents came out of the bedroom. "Dad, I heard the bear rubbing against the house last night," he said, not looking away from the television. I was too scared to get up and tell you. John felt his stomach drop. What time was that? The boy shrugged. I don't know. It was really dark. Everyone was asleep. Then little Tim, still focused on his cartoons, said casually, the cowman talks funny. John stopped breathing for a second. When did you talk to the cowman, Tim? Last night. In my room. The cowman was in your room? John's voice was tight, controlled, but inside he was panicking. No, Daddy. He's too big for my room. He talked to my window. John felt like the floor was tilting under him. What did the cowman say? Tim shrugged, mimicking the creature's sounds. He talks funny. I don't know what he said. He talks like this. Ooh, oh. The boy made a series of strange noises, somewhere between monkey chatter and human speech. Did the cowman try to get in your window? John asked, his hand starting to shake. He's too big for that, Tim said, as if his father was being silly. He made funny faces at me. He has Lincoln log teeth. John would later realize that Tim meant the creature's teeth looked square and roughly the same size as the small wooden blocks in a Lincoln Logs toy set. Apparently, the thing had spent quite a while outside Tim's window, making sounds and faces at the 4-year-old boy. Tim said it eventually laid down on the ground and went to sleep, and he could hear it snoring. John walked slowly to Tim's bedroom, his heart pounding. He approached the window cautiously and peered out, half expecting to see the creature still lying there. But there was nothing, just the morning light, the grass wet with dew, and the trees beyond swaying slightly in the breeze. John told the boys to get dressed. They were going to visit their uncle in Elma for the day. He wanted his family out of the house while he figured out what to do. His wife didn't argue. She packed up the kids and some overnight bags in case they needed to stay longer and drove off toward Elma within the hour. After they left, John called one of his crew members, a man I'll call Patrick. Patrick was an ex-state patrolman who'd been kicked off the force because of a drinking problem. Despite that, he was a good worker, reliable during the day, and John thought he might be useful for what he had in mind. When Patrick arrived, John met him at the door and asked, "Are you up for some hunting?" Patrick looked confused. "It's not hunting season, John. I don't poach, and I don't want to know about it if you do." "It's not deer I'm after," John said, and proceeded to tell him everything that had happened since Friday afternoon. Patrick listened to the whole story without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. He could see that John was dead serious, that this wasn't some elaborate joke or tall tale. When John was finished, Patrick said, "All right, let's go have a look." John had his .357 Magnum and his bolt-action 30-06 rifle. Patrick had a .38 revolver in his car, and John loaned him a 12-gauge shotgun. They were going hunting, but not for anything in any hunting regulations. The evidence. They started by circling the house, looking for any signs of a nocturnal visitor. The morning air was cool and damp, typical for the coast, even in summer, and everything had that wet, fresh smell that comes after a night of heavy dew. At the back of the house, there was a spigot for the garden hose. It had always leaked slightly, and over time that constant drip had created a patch of bare ground underneath it that had turned to mud. In the center of that mud was a footprint. It was huge, clear as day, a bare footprint that looked human in shape but was massive in scale. John told my dad it was at least 18 inches long, maybe more, and very wide. The toes were clearly defined, all 5 of them visible, and you could see the arch of the foot and the heel impression. The print was so perfect, so clear, that John got the unsettling feeling it had been left there deliberately, like the creature wanted them to know it had been there. Off to the side of the main print, there were 4 straight lines gouged into the mud, each about 8 inches long, running parallel to each other. They looked like someone had dragged their fingers through the mud, raking it. When John and Patrick walked around to the side of the house, near Tim's window, they understood what those gouges were for. Above Tim's window, a good 7 feet up the side of the house, there were 4 muddy streaks where something had dragged its fingers down the siding. The marks were thick, obvious, unmistakable, and on the window glass itself, there were dozens of large, muddy fingerprints. Not paw prints. Fingerprints. You could see the whorls and ridges in the dried mud. The glass wasn't cracked or broken, just covered in those massive prints, evidence of hands pressing against it, looking in, Patrick, who'd been mostly quiet up to this point, still trying to process everything John had told him, stared at those prints for a long time. "Jesus Christ," he finally said. "What the hell is that thing?" Before heading into the woods, John wanted to check on the family's pigs. They kept 2 of them in a pen behind the old barn, young ones weighing around 40 pounds each. Normally, when anyone approached the pen, especially around feeding time, those pigs would squeal like crazy, making that high-pitched noise that pigs make when they know food is coming. But as John and Patrick got closer to the pen, there was only silence. Complete silence. No squealing, no snorting, no sound at all. They rounded the corner of the barn, and the pen was empty. The gate was still latched, the fence was intact, but the pigs were gone. No sign of blood, no sign of struggle, no sign of how they'd gotten out or where they'd gone. They searched the barn, but found nothing out of place. The pigs had simply vanished. "You think that thing took them?" Patrick asked. "I don't know," John said. But something did. They decided it was time to head into the woods and try to find this creature. In the daylight, with 2 armed men, John felt more confident than he had the previous evening. The summer morning was bright and clear, the forest alive with bird song and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. It was completely different from the oppressive silence and darkness of the night before. They entered on the same deer trail John and John Jr. had used. John showed Patrick the spot where the fence wire was bent and the hair had been tangled. They followed the trail deeper and soon came upon the broken alder tree. It was still standing, but snapped clean through about 5 feet up, the top section hanging in the surrounding branches exactly as John had described. Patrick examined the break. "That takes some serious force," he said, running his hand over the splintered wood. "A man couldn't do that, even a really strong man." They followed what appeared to be the creature's trail and found several more trees and large branches twisted and broken. They could see faint impressions in the soft ground where something heavy had walked, though the prints weren't clear enough to get details. They spent most of the day searching, poking around, following game trails, but they saw nothing unusual beyond the broken trees and that lingering smell that would come and go on the breeze. By noon, they were hungry and decided to head back to the house for lunch. They spent the afternoon continuing the search, but found nothing more. As the sun started to get lower in the sky, John decided they'd done all they could. Patrick was starting to work on a pint of whiskey he'd retrieved from his car, and John didn't want a frightened, armed drunk around when darkness fell. He thanked Patrick for his help and sent him home. Then John sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the tree line as the light faded from the sky. Just before dark, his wife and the boys came back. She pulled into the driveway and got out, looking at John sitting there with his guns. "Did you find anything?" John told her about the footprint, the muddy fingerprints on the window, the missing pigs. Her face went pale. "We can't stay here, John. We need to leave." "Not yet," he said. "Let me handle tonight. If nothing happens, maybe it's gone. Maybe it was just passing through." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. They went inside, and John helped her push their king-size bed as far from the windows as they could get it. His wife insisted on keeping the shotgun in the bedroom with them, and John agreed, but made her promise to ask for a name before shooting anything. "If it says John, please don't shoot," he tried to joke, but neither of them laughed. The boys would sleep in their parents' bed that night, all 4 of them together. John would keep watch. The second night, as darkness fell, John settled into a chair on the front porch with his rifle, a Coleman lantern, and a flashlight. His wife brought him a plate of food, kissed him, and went back inside. He heard the lock click behind her. There was a full moon that night, bright enough to see across the field to the tree line. The night air filled with the sound of crickets and frogs from the pond behind the house, thousands of them creating a wall of sound. John tried to stay alert, scanning the field and the woods, but as the hours passed and nothing happened, his mind started to play tricks on him. Clumps of weeds in the field cast strange shadows in the moonlight, and before long John was seeing big hairy creatures sneaking up on him in every one of them. He stood up and lit a cigarette, trying to shake off the fear and paranoia. As he smoked, he wandered to the end of the porch and stood looking at the barn. Something was different, but he couldn't quite place what it was. The front of the barn faced the house, the opening dark even with the moonlight hitting the structure from the side. John stood watching that black opening as he finished his cigarette, and then he realized what was wrong. All the crickets and frogs had gone completely silent. It was as quiet as a tomb. So quiet he could hear the high-pitched buzz of his own nervous system. That sound you hear when there's absolutely no other noise. As he turned to walk back to his chair, he thought he saw movement inside the barn. He stopped and looked intently at the opening, but could see nothing in that deep darkness. Then he turned his head slightly to the side, using his peripheral vision, and he saw what looked like two red eyes hovering about 8 feet off the ground inside the barn. He couldn't see them if he looked directly at them, but when he averted his eyes just a little, they became clearer, deep, burning coal red, almost invisible in the darkness. Every few seconds, they would disappear when the creature blinked, then reappear. John's heart began pounding in his chest. He waited for the creature to leave the barn and approach the house, but it just stood there, watching. He slowly backed up to his chair, never looking away from those eyes, and picked up his 30-06 rifle. Then he walked back to the end of the porch. He stood there watching those blinking red eyes for what seemed like hours. His arms grew tired holding the rifle. His legs ached from standing still. But he didn't move, and neither did the creature. Then suddenly, the eyes blinked out and didn't come back. John watched intently, but could see no movement, no indication of where the creature had gone. He thought for a moment, then made a decision. He grabbed the flashlight and walked off the porch toward the barn. Every instinct was screaming at him to stay on the porch, to not go into that dark barn where something with glowing red eyes was hiding. But he was damned if he was going to live in fear in his own home. If this thing wanted a confrontation, he'd give it one. He moved slowly across the open ground, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but not penetrating far into the barn's interior. When he got within 20 feet of the opening, he could see inside better. An old tractor, an old pickup truck, boxes and buckets and tools. Too many places for something to hide, even something big. He walked closer, now shining the flashlight down the barrel of his rifle like they did in the war movies. He stopped at the entrance, sweeping the beam over every corner under the vehicles behind the boxes. His heart was hammering so hard he thought he might pass out. He stepped into the barn. Every sense was straining, every nerve on fire. He walked around the pickup, tensing for a huge, hairy arm to reach out and grab him at any second. He made his way clear to the back of the barn without seeing anything, and slowly turned around to leave. That's when he looked at the wide stairs leading up to the hayloft, and he froze. He knew with absolute, bone-deep certainty that the creature had climbed those stairs and was waiting up there for him to walk underneath. He knew it the way you know you're about to fall an instant before it happens. He couldn't move. He was literally paralyzed with fear. He could swear he heard the floorboards softly creaking above him as an enormous weight shifted, edging closer to the opening where it could jump down on him. His hands were frozen on the rifle. His legs wouldn't respond to his commands to move. He just stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something massive to drop on him from above. Then there was an explosion from the house. The unmistakable boom of a shotgun, followed immediately by his wife screaming. The paralysis broke. John bolted out of the barn and ran toward the house, completely forgetting about whatever might have been in the hayloft. As he ran across the open ground, he heard an inhuman roar coming from the woods behind the house. It sounded enraged and in pain. It screamed again, and he could hear branches breaking as it crashed through the forest, moving away from the house. John practically knocked down the front door, getting inside. He ran down the hall to the bedroom and found his family huddled together on the bed, his wife still pointing the shotgun at the window. One of the windows was blown out completely, glass everywhere, the curtain flapping in the night breeze. When John burst into the room, his wife swung the shotgun toward him and screamed. He hit the floor, arms over his head, waiting for the blast. But it didn't come. He slowly stood up, and she lowered the gun, her hands shaking violently. "What happened?" he demanded. She couldn't answer. She was sobbing. The boys were crying. Everyone was in shock. Little Tim was wailing. "Why did you shoot the cowman, Mommy?" "What?" John told them all to get up and come with him. He led them to the living room, then went to the front door and looked carefully around outside. He could see no sign of the creature. Everything was quiet again, that heavy silence that had fallen when it was near. He told his family to get in the car. They ran out in their pajamas and piled in. John got behind the wheel and drove them straight to his brother's house in Elma, about 30 miles away. The truth comes out. On the drive, once everyone had calmed down enough to talk, his wife told him what had happened. She said a couple of hours after they'd gone to bed, she'd finally dozed off despite her anxiety. She was awakened by Tim talking to someone and a bizarre, clicking, chirping sound coming from outside. Tim wasn't in the bed. He was standing in front of one of the windows. The moonlight was shining through both windows, illuminating the room pretty well. But there was a large shadow blocking one of the windows, like a tree was standing right in front of it, though she knew there were no trees that close to the house. She told Tim to get away from the window, trying to keep her voice quiet. "Mommy, listen," Tim said, pointing excitedly. "The cowman can sound like a bird." "Timmy, get away from the window," she said more forcefully. Right after she spoke, the sound from outside changed. They went from soft chirping to a strange gibbering, almost like human speech, but not quite, with occasional pig-like snorts mixed in. John Jr. woke up at that point and asked, rather loudly, "What is that?" This seemed to incite the creature. It hit the side of the house with its fists hard enough to make the walls tremble and shake. John Jr. screamed. Tim yelled, "Quiet! You're going to scare him away." She yelled at Tim to get away from the window and reached up to grab the shotgun from the headboard. She got out of bed and started toward Tim, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the gun. The creature leaned down and looked straight through the window at her. She screamed. It was face to face with her, separated only by a pane of glass, and it was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. She raised the shotgun, but Tim was so close to the window, she was afraid to fire. She started forward to grab her son. Then there was an explosion of breaking glass. A gigantic, hairy arm crashed through the window, reaching toward Tim. She didn't even think. She just pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the window exploded outward completely, and the arm jerked back and disappeared. A few seconds later, she heard the creature screaming in the woods. That same enraged, pained sound John had heard from the barn. "It was trying to get Tim," she sobbed as she told the story. "It was trying to grab my baby." They stayed the rest of Saturday night and all of Sunday at John's brother's house. John told his brother everything, but he could see the skepticism in his eyes. His brother didn't really believe him, but he was kind enough not to say so. Monday morning, the destruction. Early Monday morning, before they had to head to work, John and his brother drove back to John's house. They'd left the front door open in their rush to escape Saturday night, and John was afraid animals or vandals might have gotten inside. What they found when they walked through that door stopped them both in their tracks. The house looked like a tornado had gone through it. The couch was flipped upside down. They had a large, heavy console television, one of those massive things that took two strong men to move, and it had been thrown across the room. It was lying against the far wall in a spray of broken glass and splintered wood. The kitchen was destroyed. The refrigerator had been knocked over, food spilled everywhere, milk and juice pooling on the floor. Cabinets had been ripped open, their contents scattered. Chairs were broken. The table was on its side. But the bedroom doors, both boys' rooms, had been left closed, and those rooms were completely untouched. The bathroom, too. It was as if the creature had known which rooms the family used and which rooms belonged to the children, and had deliberately left the children's rooms alone. The master bedroom was torn apart. The pillows were ripped open, feathers everywhere like it had snowed indoors. The chest of drawers was knocked over. The large mirror smashed into 1,000 pieces. The bed they'd pushed away from the windows was shoved back against the wall. John's brother looked around in complete shock. "John, you need to call the police. Someone did this. Someone insane." John looked at him. "And tell them what?" "That Bigfoot destroyed my house." They stood there in the wreckage of what had been a normal home just 3 days earlier. John told my dad that the smell was still in the house, even 2 days later. That wild animal smell mixed with garbage and wet dog, so strong it made his eyes water. John's brother waited in the car while John went to my dad's mill to tell him what had happened. That's when my dad heard the full story for the first time. After John was finished, my dad said, "Well, let's go have a look at it then." They drove back to the house, and my dad surveyed the damage. John pulled the clump of reddish-brown hair from his pocket, where he'd been keeping it since Friday evening, and showed it to my dad. As they walked through the ruined house, my dad pointed out cracks in the ceiling where something had apparently stood up and hit its head, something at least 8 feet tall. John told my dad they couldn't live there anymore. Even if the creature was gone, they would always be afraid. His wife was terrified. The kids were traumatized. They needed to start over somewhere else. The homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover any of the damage. The adjuster came out, looked at everything, and claimed John must have done it himself in a drunken rage. There was no way they could explain what had really happened, so they had no recourse. My dad helped them find a place in Aberdeen, away from the isolated coast, away from Copalis Beach and those deep woods. He gave John a loan for new furniture and everything they needed to start over. The house in Copalis was eventually fixed up and sold. And as far as my dad knows, there were never any more incidents there. The questions that remain. My dad lost contact with John and his family in the mid-1980s. They moved out of state, trying to put the whole experience behind them, and he never heard from them again. John's brother, who'd witnessed the destruction in the house, died around the same time. When I asked my dad about specific details, he had answers for most of my questions. Why didn't they call the police? John had a lot of pride and a lot of common sense. He knew he couldn't logically explain what had happened to the authorities without sounding insane. He didn't want the story to get out and have everyone think he'd lost his mind. Did they save the hair sample? John never mentioned it again after showing it to my dad, and my dad never asked. It probably got lost in the move or was thrown away. A missed opportunity, certainly, but understandable given the trauma they were dealing with. Did my dad see the footprint and the muddy fingerprints himself? Yes, he did. He said the footprint looked like a giant barefoot human had stepped very carefully in the center of the mud. It was the clearest print of any kind he'd ever seen, the toes individually visible, the arch and heel perfectly defined. He wasn't a tracker, but he knew it wasn't from any animal he'd ever heard of. What about the neighbors? Didn't they hear any of this? My dad asked John about that. John said if the neighbors heard anything, none of them ever mentioned it. Perhaps they were too far away, or perhaps they heard things but dismissed them as wind or animals or their imagination. Or perhaps they heard things and were too frightened to acknowledge what they meant. I asked my dad if he thought it was possible John had made the whole thing up, that maybe he really had trashed his house in some kind of breakdown and invented this elaborate cover story. My dad was firm in his answer, no. Absolutely not. John and his family were genuinely terrified of that house. They didn't want to go back even to get their clothes and personal belongings. They had to be convinced to make one more trip to collect what they needed. And if it was just a story, what would John have gained from it? To profit from a story, you have to share it widely. John only told my dad and a couple of other people and swore them to secrecy. That's not the behavior of someone looking for attention or trying to make money. My dad also said that whatever had trashed that house was no human. That television had to have weighed close to 200 pounds, and it was obviously thrown with tremendous force. The refrigerator was enormous, and it had been knocked over like it was a toy. And even 2 days later, that smell lingered, that wild animal smell that made your stomach turn. I asked if there might have been 2 creatures involved, considering the incident in the barn when John thought something was in the hayloft. My dad said he'd asked John the same question. John felt there was only one creature, that it had lured him into the barn, then snuck out the side door to get to the house. What he thought he heard in the hayloft was either his imagination running wild, or just a raccoon or some other common animal. The behavior. One of the strangest aspects of the whole story, to me, is the creature's behavior. It seemed focused almost exclusively on little Tim, the 4-year-old. Tim was the first to see it. Tim was the one it talked to through the window. Tim was the one it tried to reach for when it smashed through the window. And Tim was the only one who never showed any fear of it. He seemed to think of it as his friend, his cowman. He was upset when his mother shot at it. Even after everything that happened, Tim talked about the creature with a kind of affection. The creature was assumed to be male because of its size and aggressive behavior, and because there was no evidence of breasts like the famous Patterson-Gimlin film creature. But my dad, somewhat jokingly, suggested that maybe the behavior was more like a mother who had lost her baby and was looking for a replacement. The focus on the small child, the attempts to communicate rather than attack, the fact that it never actually hurt anyone despite having multiple opportunities to do so. When I asked my dad if Tim was perhaps an unusually hairy child, maybe suffering from hypertrichosis or some other condition that might have made him smell different or look different to the creature, my dad said no. Tim was a completely normal little boy with normal brown hair on his normal head. The creature's behavior remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the whole event. It followed John Jr. through the woods. It chased them across the field. It destroyed their house. But it never actually harmed anyone. When it knocked John Jr. down, it could have easily killed the boy, but it just pushed him aside. When it reached through the window toward Tim, was it trying to grab him or trying to communicate? We'll never know the answers to those questions. Other encounters. After my dad finished telling me about John and his family, he mentioned that there had been other possible Bigfoot encounters over the years involving his logging crews in the woods around Grays Harbor County. None of them were quite as dramatic or terrifying as John's experience, but they were strange enough to remember. Men reporting massive footprints in the mud near their work sites. Sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal. The feeling of being watched when they were deep in the woods. Equipment being moved or disturbed during the night when the sites were empty. Trees twisted and broken in ways that didn't make sense. Too high up for a bear, too strong for a person. Most of the time, the men wouldn't talk about these things openly. They'd mention them quietly to each other, sharing looks that said they'd all seen or heard something, but nobody wanted to be the first to say what they really thought it was. In the logging camps and mills of the Pacific Northwest in the 1960s and 70s, you didn't talk about Bigfoot unless you wanted to be laughed at or thought crazy. But the experiences accumulated. Enough men seeing enough strange things that the silence itself became a kind of acknowledgement. They knew. They knew something was out there in those deep woods, something that avoided humans most of the time, but occasionally left signs of its presence. My dad told me these stories matter-of-factly, without embellishment or drama. These are just facts of life when you worked in the deep wilderness. Sometimes you encountered things you couldn't explain. You dealt with it and moved on. Reflection. I came away from that conversation with my dad with more questions and answers, but also with something valuable. A story that I believe is true, told by people who had no reason to lie and every reason to keep it secret. John was a respected foreman, a trusted employee, a family man. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain by making up this story. His family was genuinely traumatized by what happened to them. They left their home, left the area, tried to start their lives over somewhere else where they could forget about the Cowman of Copalis Beach. My dad is one of the most practical, level-headed people I know. He spent his entire life in the timber industry, in the woods, dealing with real dangers like falling trees and broken equipment and harsh weather. He's not prone to flights of fancy or believing in things without evidence. And he believes John's story completely. What happened in that house on the coast in July of the mid-1960s? I think something real happened. Something that doesn't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. Something that lives in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, occasionally crossing paths with humans in ways that terrify and confuse us. The Cowman of Copalis Beach might have been a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it. Or it might have been something else entirely, something we don't have a name for yet. But it was real. It left physical evidence. Footprints, fingerprints, broken trees, a destroyed house, missing livestock, traumatized witnesses. And somewhere out there, maybe Tim, now in his 60s, still remembers his cowman. The creature that talked to him through his window in strange chirping sounds. The creature with Lincoln log teeth that made funny faces at him. The creature his mother shot at when it reached through the glass. Does he remember it with fear like the rest of his family? Or does he remember it with that strange affection he showed as a 4-year-old when he thought of it as his friend? I'll probably never know. But I know this. The woods around Copalis Beach are still deep and dark. The forests still stretch for miles, with places humans rarely go. And if you're ever out there, in those remote areas where the old-growth timber used to stand, pay attention to the sound around you. If the birds suddenly go silent, if you smell something like wet dog and rotting garbage, if you feel like you're being watched by something just out of sight in the thick underbrush, don't ignore those feelings. Your instincts are probably right. If you found this story as compelling as I did, if it made you think differently about what might be out there in the wilderness, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories out there, more encounters that people have kept secret for decades, and I'll continue to share them with you. The world is stranger than we think. The forest holds secrets we're only beginning to understand. And sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that might actually be true. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe think twice before wandering too deep into the woods alone.